Hello, everyone. Today I will be discussing the historical context surrounding the incidents at St. Aubin Priory between 1251 and 1268. I went over all the scandalous incidents in part 1, so I recommend watching that video first if you've not already done so. That will give you all the context you need, so I'm not repeating myself. Today I will be discussing several reoccurring subjects and themes in Eudes of Rouen's visitation records: Cistercian nuns, simony, monastic finances, and how that relates to chastity. As a side note on the language I use, when generally speaking about religious houses for women, I'll use the term nunnery. When referring to religious houses for men, I'll use the term monastery. This is for simplicity's sake. And a short disclaimer, French isn't my native tongue, so while I've looked up how to pronounce the French names and went over pronunciations with people who speak French, including spending 5 minutes trying to get stuff right and whatever, and I did practice, I do still struggle a bit with the pronunciations. I'm terribly sorry in advance. I promise I am trying my best. Now, before we get into the video, I just wanted to say December 7th is the first anniversary of my novel, Decessit Vita Matris. It will have been out for a year at that point, which I think is very exciting. So if you're excited in reading a novel about demon pregnancies, Cistercian monks, knights, and the complexities of gender set in 13th century Devon, Decessit Vita Matris is available on sale on Itch.io, Amazon, and through order at your local bookstore. Currently, the ebook is for sale for 99 cents on Amazon and $1.99 on Itch.io. However, due to increasing censorship regarding queer art online, I do recommend you purchase the physical book. All right, now, Brother Gilbert, in my novel, is a Cistercian monk, so let's talk about some 13th century Cistercian nuns. So let's start with the fact St. Aubin Priory was a Cistercian priory for women. Now, if you know anything about monastic history, you might be wondering why the Archbishop was making visits to the priory instead of someone from the Cistercian order itself, as was customary to do so. Well, this is likely due to the fact that the priory was filled with nuns instead of monks. The Cistercian order was founded in 1098 as a reaction to the laxity of the Benedictine order. At the time, monks from the Benedictine order thought the monks were getting a bit too comfortable. I mean, they kind of were right. The Benedictines did seem to have more fun than the Cistercians. At first, in the 12th century, the Cistercians as a whole were very against women joining their monastic order. Early Cistercian statutes said that women must be avoided at all costs. They also said that no Cistercian abbot or monk could bless a nun. This eventually changed in the 13th century. However, the Cistercian order's reluctance towards women did not stop women from wanting to join the order and following the Cistercian rule. This resulted in quite a few nunneries being founded that followed the Cistercian monastic rule, but were not officially part of the order. This meant that the Cistercian order would not be doing visitations. Instead, visitations would be done by the local ecclesiastical authority, such as the Archbishop of Eudes of Rouen. It also meant that their finances were a bit all over the place, unless the nunnery had a way to be self-sufficient, whether that be through rich patrons or their own land, and ideally all monasteries and nunneries were self-sufficient. This is something I will go into further in the monastic finance part of this video. The 12th century had a bit of a boom regarding women and men joining monastic life. Scholar Christina Adena writes, quote, "Many women, especially from the 12th century onward, managed to organize themselves into smaller, less formal communities, and to position themselves outside the boundaries of ecclesiastical institutions. The 12th century brought a new phase of rapid expansion and experimentation. Women from all backgrounds, virgins, widows, wives, separated from their husbands, and young women of ill repute sought to abandon their old lives in favor of a new and radical vita religiosa characterized by penance, asceticism, and charity." Unquote. During this time, men and women would sometimes form double communities, where men and women lived in the same monastery, though they would be separated in the actual living spaces. They would interact to some degree, if the story of the Nun of Wotton is anything to go by. The Nun of Wotton is another scandalous story about a medieval nun, and a very sad and gruesome one. She deserves her own video. Poor thing. In 1147, St. Gilbert of Sepringham wanted to have his order, the Gilbertines, which had women and men in it, taken over by the Cistercians. He even traveled to Citeaux, where he met the Pope and St. Bernard of Clairvaux. They were impressed with St. Gilbert and treated him warmly, but they still told him no. They claimed they were not prepared to take care of nuns. In 1194, 1 degree punished the abbots from Laferta, Pontegui, and Clairvaux for allowing nuns into the choir during the dedication of the Situ Basilica. However, it should be noted that the decree doesn't specify if these nuns were following the Cistercian rule, but the point still stands that in the 12th century, the authorities in the Cistercian order wanted to avoid women and nuns. The fact that the Cistercian abbots were interacting with nuns to the point that they were allowing them into the choir during a dedication does indicate attitudes towards women were shifting. Over time, more Cistercian monks seemed to be somewhat okay with women following their rule, but they were still not considered part of the order. By the 13th century, the Cistercian order did allow women in highly restrictive ways. To vastly oversimplified things, the Cistercians seemed to eventually kind of just give up trying to prevent the women from joining. Again, I'm vastly oversimplifying things, but we don't have time to go into everything. It helped that the Cistercians had a lot of outside pressure to allow women into their order. This pressure came from royals and nobility who liked the Cistercians and were their patrons. Rich patrons such as Alfonso VIII of Castile, Jean and Marguerite of Flanders admired the Cistercian way of life, so much that they founded their own nunneries and priories. In fact, Alfonso VIII of Castile said if he were ever to become a monk, he'd like to become a Cistercian. So it's one thing to tell a lord of the manor like St. Gilbert that he's not allowed to start nunneries. Telling your royal/noble patron who is very rich and very powerful that they cannot start a nunnery is a completely different matter. By the middle of the 13th century, a large number of nunneries were formally accepted into the order. In 1241, 20 out of the 75 statutes at the general chapter of that year dealt with nuns and their needs. However, this did not mean the Cistercian order was going to make it easy for nuns. For one, the Cistercian order would only accept new religious foundations for women if they had the financial means to support themselves and were enclosed. In 1213, the Cistercian General Chapter made a rule saying that no nun could leave her nunnery without the permission of the Father Abbot, the monk who was the nun's mentor. In 1218, the decree was further specified, saying that even the abbess of the house could only leave the nunnery if it related to the business of the house and if she was accompanied by 2 nuns, and even then, she would need the Father Abbot's permission if possible. It's important to note in 1218, a decree was made that no Cistercian nunnery was allowed to be built within 6 leagues of a male monastery. So in an era without cars, it would make contacting the Father Abbot very difficult in the case of an emergency. Though I suppose the added bonus would be preventing temptation, but as we can see from part 1, temptation happened no matter what. These strict rules regarding enclosure were a bit impractical. Even monks interacted with the laity and left their monasteries sometimes. Nuns also had to interact with the laity, whether that be the abbess purchasing land from nobles or officials hiring peasants to work the nunnery's land. Or, as we've seen in the case of the nuns of St. Aubin Priory, nuns saw their family, ate with the laity, interacted with servants, or the local miller with a bad reputation. For further historical context, it wasn't until 1298 that Pope Boniface VIII made it canon law that every nun, no matter her order, had to be enclosed. In summary, the fact that the nuns at St. Aubin Priory had the Archbishop of Rouen and not a member of the Cistercian order conducting their visitation reflects the Cistercian order's misogynistic attitude at the time. It also suggests that the Cistercian order was not keeping an eye on the nuns as much as they should, not that they even wanted to. Now let's go on to part 2, Simony. One thing that Eudes' register kept mentioning was simony. So what exactly is simony? I'm going to do a little bit of a kid doing a book report bit here, so bear with me. The Cambridge Dictionary defines simony as, quote, in the Christian church in the past, the buying or selling of advantages such as paid positions in the church or pardons, official forgiveness, which was considered to be a sin, an act of breaking a religious law, unquote. Eudes of Rouen's contemporary, St. Thomas Aquinas, also has much to say on the matter. St. Thomas Aquinas describes simony in his Magnus Opus, Summa Theologica, as, quote, a thing is ill-gotten when he that has it may not keep it, and yet he may not return it to the person from whom he received it because he received it unjustly, while the latter gave it unjustly. This happens in simony, wherein both giver and receiver contravene the justice of divine law, so that restitution is to be made not to the giver, but by giving alms. The same applies to all similar cases of illegal giving and receiving, unquote. St. Benedict, the author of the Rule of St. Benedict, which is the big name text for Western monastic life in the medieval period, did not require any donation or gift of some sort to the monastery or nunnery a person wanted to join. It was purely optional. But by the 11th century, it was expected. If a person or their family refused to give a gift, they could do that, but the monastery might not take the wannabe novice in. During most of the 11th century, these donations were not really considered simony, but by the 13th century, the attitudes changed. Scholar Joseph H. Lynch refers to the 13th century as, quote, an age of law and lawyers, unquote, both in an ecclesiastical and secular context. The 13th century had the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. The Fourth Lateran Council is one of the biggest councils and had a wide effect on the medieval church, thus medieval society. It's one of those councils that is so influential, in fact, that whenever I write about my early medieval monks, I always have to check to make sure the thing they believe in or the ritual they're doing predates 1215. Of course, the extent to which the council's constitutions were followed after it happened is a subject for scholarly debate and not one we have time to get into right now. Canon 64 of the Fourth Lateran Council discusses simonical entry in detail, including what the punishment should be for those guilty of it. Quote, summary, religious are not to be received for a price. If this happens, both the one receiving and the one received shall, without hope of restoration, be removed from the community. Those who were received in such a manner, before the publication of this decree, must be placed in other communities of the same order. Text. Since the stain of simony has so infected many nuns that scarcely any are received into the community without a price, doing this on the plea of poverty to conceal that evil, we strictly forbid that this be done in the future, decreeing that whoever in the future shall be guilty of such irregularity, both the one receiving and the one received, whether subject or superius, shall, without hope of restoration, be removed from their monastery to one of a stricter observance to do penance for the remainder of their life. These nuns, however, who have been so received before the publication of this decree, are to be removed from the monasteries which they entered in a wrong manner and placed in others of the same order. But if on account of lack of room they cannot perchance be conveniently placed elsewhere, lest they should be to their own loss become wanderers in the world, let them be received anew per modum dispensationis in the same monastery, and from the priority of places which they held in the community, let them be assigned to the lower ones. This we decree is to be observed also with regard to monks and other regulars, but lest they should attempt to excuse themselves on grounds of simplicity or ignorance, we command the bishops to see to it that this decree is published every year throughout their diocese. Unquote. Despite the fact the Fourth Lateran Council banned simonical entry in 1215, it was still occurring, as we saw in the first part of this video. Joseph H. Lynch writes that prevention of simonical entry was taken seriously, but also enforced to varying degrees in the 13th century. As we saw in Canon 64, there was harsh punishments for monastics who committed simonical entry. However, kicking the offender out of monastic life entirely was rarely done. After Pope Innocent III's death, Pope Innocent III helped construct the canons. After all, before 1215, simonical entry was slowly becoming frowned upon, but not entirely banned. A lot of monastics paid to join monasteries, and you can't really get rid of everyone who did that. It's simply not practical. There would barely be anyone left. However, if the monastic superior committed additional grievous crimes, then exile was a bit more plausible. Though it should be also noted that penal exile to another monastery was not always practical either. For one, you've got to find another monastery who is willing to take them in, and that's not exactly cheap or convenient to do so, again, especially in an age without cell phones or cars. Bishops had discretion regarding punishments for simonical entry, so instead of being thrown out of monastic life altogether or sent to a monastery in the same order, the monastic might lose seniority and have to do penance of some sort. Bishops also had to be reasonable about which specific case he encountered. This is especially the case when following the law to the fullest extent was a bit ridiculous. For example, if everyone in the nunnery gained entry through simony, it's not really practical to throw everyone out. Also, simonical entry was still occurring in the 14th century. Necromancer monk, yes, you heard that right. I talked all about it in a previous video. It will be linked down below. John of Morgany discusses how his sister is unable to become a nun as their family cannot pay the nunnery for her entry. Quote, also, after that, the Virgin Mary appeared to me, and in answer to my question about this, how is it possible that she his sister, can become a nun when she needs so many worldly goods to give to the said abbey before she can enter, and when, as to worldly goods, she seems to have few or none, she responded, I will provide the necessaries for her. And from that time to this, my sister waited devoutly for that promise and that place. At the time when I wrote this page, namely the year of the incarnation of the Lord, 1313, calends of June, she was still waiting for what the most sweet Virgin Mary might deign to concede to her and fulfill in her, as she promised to her and to me. She saw many other things, and so did I, which are not written in this book. We wrote this down and told you this so that you should know and believe that the Ars Notoria is evil and the present art is good. Unquote. The present art he's talking about is his own book of rituals that he says, oh, it's not necromancy. It kind of is. It's ritual magic, but again, I talk about that in another video. One thing I find particularly interesting is that evidence suggests simonical entry was more of an issue with nuns rather than monks. This is likely due to nuns' finances on average being worse off than monks' finances. St. Thomas Aquinas comments on monastic finances in simonical entry. Quote, it is unlawful to enact or receive anything as price for entering a monastery, but in the case of small monasteries that are unable to support so many persons, it is lawful, while entrance to the monastery is free, to accept something for the support of those who are about to be received into the monastery, if its revenues are insufficient. In like manner, it is lawful to be easier in admitting to a monastery a person who has proved his regard for that monastery by the generosity of his alms, just as, on the other hand, it is lawful to incite a person's regard for a monastery by means of temporal benefits, in order that he may thereby be induced to enter the monastery, although it is unlawful to agree to give or receive something for entrance into a monastery. Unquote. So simonical entry was one way monasteries made money, and it helped to offset the cost of any new members. After all, monasteries did need to feed and clothe their monks and nuns. However, making money through new members does cause another problem. Eventually, the gift might run out, if it is money and not land. But the new monastic is still there, needing food and new clothes. An impoverished monastery or nunnery would get short-term gains, but long-term liabilities. Simony is a serious offense in the Catholic Church. Some church writers even compared it to sodomy. Besides the spiritual offense of selling holy things, there's also a social and political element to it as well. First off, clergy and monastics in the Middle Ages had a special social and political status. To oversimplify things again, the investiture controversy happened when secular heads of state and the Pope argued over who was allowed to choose bishops, abbots, etc. Eventually the Pope won. He can choose who he wants to be superiors in the church and does not need secular authorities' permission to do so. This benefited the church because then the laity couldn't select who they wanted. After all, this church has a lot of spiritual, financial, political, and social power. You do not want a secular person deciding who gets to be a priest, or in our case, a nun. That being said, secular royalty did have control over members of the clergy and monastic in secular manners. To justify the church's special status, clergy and monastics had to prove they deserved it by being morally superior to the laity. However, it's very hard to argue you're morally superior and don't need royalty's permission to select superiors if you're essentially buying your way into a job, getting pregnant out of wedlock, getting others pregnant out of wedlock, or a variety of other morally dubious things that were considered to be morally dubious at the time. So this is why Eudes of Rouen was very angry when Sir Robert the Knight paid St. Aubin Priory 100 shillings a year for his daughter to be a nun. The nuns would not have taken in the girl otherwise, so her father bought her a place. The nuns at St. Aubin ignored Archbishop Eudes' command. They do not take in any more nuns without his permission, thus ignoring his ecclesiastical authority. In both instances, the laity is asserting control over the church, which they should not have. Anyway, let's talk about St. Aubin's finances and the historical context surrounding it, as well as the context and connection between their finances and the nuns breaking their vow of chastity. As previously mentioned, in the perfect world, nunneries and monasteries are self-sufficient, so they don't have to go into debt. They could make money from their land, whether that be from renting it out to tenants, having a good harvest, thus not needing to purchase food, or having an overabundant harvest and selling things such as wine and grain or whatever materials they produce. Unfortunately, St. Aubin Priory did not exist in the perfect world and had extremely bad finances. As we saw in the first video, they were constantly deep in debt. Generally speaking, medieval nuns struggled with their finances way more in comparison to monks. There were several reasons for that. Nuns were supposed to be cloistered, so they were not allowed to go out and try to earn money. Nuns were also not allowed to take in children to be educated and make money schooling them. That was a common way for nuns to make an income, but Archbishop Eudes, who was very much a reformer, did not approve of this and tried to put a stop to it. However, as we saw in the first part, in reality, nuns left their nunneries and educated local children. As women, nuns were not allowed to say Mass or hear confessions, so they had to hire and pay a priest to do that for them. This cut into their income in a way monks did not have to deal with. Then, of course, there was the general state of the economy and land availability in the 13th century. In the 12th century, a lot of Cistercian houses were founded. These houses had ample opportunities to get access to land and other resources. By the time the 13th century had rolled around, a lot of land was already claimed. Furthermore, inflation was an issue in the 13th century. The cost of living rose while income stayed the same. Wow, I wonder what that's like. I'm so glad I don't live in a time period where vegetables go up by 10p every time I go to the grocery store and my income stays the same. I can't imagine how stressful that would be. Anyway, Simonical entry was one way to help with financial woes, at least temporarily. However, new nuns meant more mouths to feed, house, and clothe, which would contribute to the overall poverty of a nunnery. Besides the attitudes towards simony, there was another reason. Eudes of Rouen did not want St. Aubin taking in any more nuns. They simply could not afford it. They were in massive amounts of debt, and later in the register, their priory was quite literally falling apart. Another interesting tidbit is that during the time of Eudes of Rouen wrote his register, monasteries struggled to get monks, but nunneries had no such issues. It was common for multiple daughters from the same family to join the same nunnery. This was much less common for sons. It got to the point where the Cistercian order eventually had to set a maximum populations for nunneries. Now, as mentioned previously, there was a correlation between poor finances and nuns breaking their vows of chastity. Penelope D. Johnson's book, Equal in Monastic Profession, Religious Women in Medieval France, argues that statistical evidence suggests the poorer the nunnery was, the more likely the nuns would be accused of breaking their vows or actually breaking their vows. And overall, a low number of monastics are documented breaking their vows. Now, this could be because they were smart and they were not caught, but it could also be they just weren't doing it. Now, if you're unaware, monastics in the Latin, aka Roman Catholic Church, took a vow of chastity/celibacy. I'm using both chastity and celibacy interchangeably, but scholar Ruth Mazocaras separates the two concepts. Quote, chastity in the Middle Ages generally meant the absence of sexual activity, but could also be used to mean the absence of illicit sexual activity. In contemporary usage, celibacy is more or less equivalent to abstinence, but that was not the medieval meaning. Celibacy meant the unmarried state. It was not oxymoronic, although it might be sinful to be celibate and engage in sexual activity. A cleric who did so violated his chastity, not his celibacy. The term celibate was generally reserved for those for whom the unmarried state was permanent, unquote. So why was chastity so important for nuns and monks in the medieval church? Well, there are a few reasons. I could make a whole video on sexuality in the medieval church, but I'm not going to do that today. For the sake of time, I will supply a few simplified reasons why chastity was so important. One reason is that lust was connected to original sin, aka when Eve disobeyed God and ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. The second reason is that in early Christianity, they believed while God's creation was good, it, such as the human body, must be under control. You had to avoid hedonistic desires for the sake of one's soul. This did not just have to do with sex, this also applied to sustenance, both food and drink, clothing, and sleep. And that attitude from the early Christian church was applicable to the medieval church and even today. A third reason is that sexual activity was considered polluting. Fun fact, certain bodily fluids that are vital in creating life are often euphemistically referred to as pollution in medieval texts. It was considered polluting for both men and women, but the consequences would be higher for women. In the medieval period, women were seen as defective and inferior versions of men. They were considered to be more lust-driven than men. If a woman was able to remain a virgin, she was considered to have more self-control and spiritually masculine. Being spiritually masculine was the ideal state for women according to the church. And the final reason I will give, though again, there's way more to this and way more reasons, relates back to the church needing to separate itself from the laity with a moral superiority. Celibacy was a significant way for clergy and monastics to distinguish themselves from secular folk. Carus points out that, quote, most religions have something that sets their priestly caste apart from common believers, usually the observance of particular taboos. For Christianity, the important taboo was sexual, unquote. Anyway, back to poverty and breaking one's vows of celibacy. Penelope D. Johnson found that in her sample data, there was a correlation between the likelihood nuns would break their vows of chastity, how well the nunnery was run by superiors, and poverty. Basically, if the nunnery was poorly run and in economic crisis, nuns were more likely to break their vows. At St. Aubin Priory, most of the visitation entries note their debt and general poverty. They owed a lot of money to the king. Sometimes they barely had provision or supplies, and in later entries, some of their buildings needed repair. The main nunnery building couldn't even be used when it rained. So the nuns at St. Aubin were constantly getting sick and unable to pray the amount they were required to as nuns. So it's really no wonder the nuns were fighting with each other over chickens and having affairs. Their lives are miserable, and not in a way a nun would expect it to be when she joined a nunnery. Also, as an interesting little tidbit, St. Aubin Priory had the highest recorded number of sexual offenses for a single monastic house in Eudes' register. Johnson described several factors that made it more likely for nunneries to have sexual scandals. A small environment, so St. Aubin had 16 nuns at its maximum, and Eudes sent that 16th nun away because she was taken in without his permission and through simony. Isolation. I've not been able to find the priory on a map, so I don't know how isolated it was. I've found several St. Aubin churches and abbeys in northern France, but it's not been clear which one is the St. Aubin I'm looking for, if it even still survives. And poverty. These factors make life extremely hard and contribute to low morale. Now, it should be noted that for 2/3 of nuns in Eudes' register, their known partners were members of the clergy. This begs the question how consensual some of the relationships were. I'm sure some of them really weren't. That being said, nuns were more likely to form long-lasting relationships with their lovers compared to monks, who usually had brief affairs, or little flings with theirs. Nuns were more likely to form relationships with people who lived close to the nunnery, likely due to enclosure, while monks' lovers were more likely to live farther away from their monastery. Johnson argues that the nuns having more long-term affairs and when they're living in poverty has to do with nuns seeking intimacy and some sort of emotional and physical satisfaction while they lived in poor conditions. I guess you could kind of compare it to the treat culture nowadays, where everyone's like, the only way to get through the day, I'm just going to have a little treat, spend $5 or whatever on a bubble tea or, a lipstick. It is a common thing that happens when times are tough. So interestingly enough, when monks had affairs, there's much less correlation between the size of their monastery and its location compared to nuns' affairs. Finally, Archbishop Eudes believed that there was a connection between a monastic house's morals and their finances. If they had bad morals, they would have bad finances. Scholar Adam J. Davis points out that in reality, there was no connection, and some religious houses in Eudes' register were great spiritually and morally, but still had bad finances. Funnily enough, some medieval chroniclers argued that if a religious house had bad finances, then that meant their superiors were more focused on the spiritual and moral aspects of running a monastic house. In St. Aubin Priory's case, Eudes was right about morals and finances being linked. Also, I'm sorry if you can hear any construction going on in the background. A next door neighbor is getting their roof repaired. And I am trying to finish this video today because it's taken me 2 months. Well, no, it's going to be almost 3 months to get this done. Anyway, so Eudes was right about morals and finances being linked. However, for the nuns, their fighting and vow breaking was more likely to be a result of their poor living conditions due to the bad finances than their morals causing the poverty. All right, and that is our video for today. It is finally done. Huzzah! So relieved. It's taken me so long to get this done. So I hope you found it educational and enjoyable. I am moving across the Atlantic soon, so my next video might not be out for quite some time, which again is why I was trying to get this done as soon as possible. So if I do post something in the next few weeks, then it's probably just going to be an easier video to make. Not going to lie, this video required a lot of research. And again, it took me way longer than I thought it would when I had the idea back in September 2025. Like, I didn't even include some of the stuff that I wanted to, just because it was taking me so long to get this done. So before I end this video, I'd like to thank my patrons, Matthias and Carl, over on Patreon for their support. Paid members get to see early versions of scripts, works in progress of my web novels, discussions of what I'm researching, and the occasional art piece and travel photos. If you're interested in becoming a patron, please do check out my Patreon. Tiers start at $1 a month, and everything is accessible even at the lowest tier. I also have a coffee as well, and every bit of support really helps, especially that I'm going to be moving across the Atlantic and going to be job hunting and needing to find housing and such. So anyway, thank you and goodbye until next time.